The town of Oakhaven did not just exist, it simmered. It sat in a deep, verdant valley where the wind always seemed to lose its strength, filtered through the thick, ancient canopy of oaks and maples that gave the neighborhood its name. I remember the morning I decided to really look at it, truly look at it. It was a Tuesday. The sun was a pale, buttery disk struggling to pierce through the low-hanging mist that clung to the emerald lawns like a damp veil. I stood on my porch, my fingers curled around a ceramic mug. The warmth of the coffee seeped through the glaze, a small, localized heat against the morning's chill. I liked that heat. It was a grounding point. I watched the steam rise in slow, lazy curls, disappearing into the stagnant air. In Oakhaven, even the steam seemed to take its time. My routine was a steady, rhythmic thing, a series of predictable gears turning in a silent machine. Wake at 6. Brew the coffee. Feel the wood-grain texture of the floorboards under my bare feet. Listen to the house settle. It was a simple life, and I was proud of its simplicity. As a technical editor, my entire world was built on the removal of friction. I took the jagged, confusing sentences of instruction manuals and smoothed them until they were flat, clear, and utterly obedient. I liked knowing that if you followed the right steps, the machine would work. I liked knowing that life had a sequence. I looked across the street toward David's house. David was a high school math teacher, a man whose life was even more structured than mine. At exactly 7:30 a.m., his front door would groan, a low, wooden sound I had heard every day for 7 years, and he would appear in his navy blue robe. I waited. I watched the play of light on his dark asphalt driveway. The silence was so profound that I could hear the distant, rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum of a morning jogger's sneakers 3 blocks away. It wasn't a noise, it was a heartbeat. The door opened. David stepped out. His movements were fluid, almost practiced. He walked to the end of his driveway to collect the newspaper. He moved with a strange grace. His head tilted slightly to the side, as if he were listening to a frequency I couldn't quite catch. He reached down, his fingers brushing the plastic sleeve of the paper, and then he looked up. He saw me. He offered a small, polite wave. His palm was flat, his fingers unmoving. I waved back, the ceramic of my mug clinking softly against my ring. It was our ritual, a silent contract of normalcy. He looks well, I thought. Everything is exactly where it should be. Later that morning, I walked down to Willow Lane toward the local cafe, The Hearth. The walk took exactly 12 minutes if I didn't stop to admire the gardens. The air carried the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, sweet smell of someone's fireplace. It was an intoxicating smell, the smell of safety. As I passed Mrs. Gable's house, I saw her kneeling in the dirt. She was 80, maybe older, but her hands were as steady as a surgeon's. She was tending to her rose bushes, her silver garden shears glinting with a sharp, cold light. The soil around her was dark and rich, smelling of mulch and old water. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," I said, slowing my pace. I didn't want to startle her. In this town, sudden movements felt like a violation. She didn't look up immediately. She finished a precise cut on a withered stem, watched it fall to the grass, and then turned her head. Her sun hat cast a deep, cavernous shadow over her face, making her eyes look like 2 dark pools. But her smile was brilliant. It was wide, fixed, and remarkably steady. "Good morning," she replied. Her voice had a papery quality, like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "The frost is coming tonight," I noted, looking at the delicate petals. "Are you worried about the blooms?" She didn't look back at the roses. She kept her eyes locked on mine. The silence stretched between us, growing heavy and thick. I could hear the faint snip-snip of a neighbor's shears further down the road, perfectly synchronized with the ticking of the watch on my wrist. "Oh, everything is fine," she said. She didn't blink. "Everything is perfectly fine, Henry." I felt a small, inexplicable shiver. It wasn't the cold. It was the way she said the word perfectly. It held too much weight, like a stone dropped into a deep well. I nodded, offering a small smile, and continued toward the cafe. Inside the hearth, the air was thick with the scent of roasted beans and cinnamon. It was a warm, golden space. Leo, the young barista, was behind the counter. He was moving with a calm efficiency, wiping a porcelain cup with a white cloth. Circle, circle, buff. Circle, circle, buff. The usual, Henry? He asked without looking up. Please, I said, leaning against the counter. The wood was cool and polished. I noticed Leo's eyes. They were bloodshot, the whites traced with tiny red veins. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, yet his hands didn't shake as he poured the milk. Rough night, Leo? I asked softly. He stopped pouring. The stream of milk hit the coffee with a gentle, splashing sound. He looked at me then. His gaze was intense, almost pleading, but his lips were curved into that same, steady Oakhaven smile. I'm fine, he said. The words came out in a single, smooth exhale. I'm just fine. Everything is fine. I took my cup. The heat felt good against my palms. I sat in my usual corner booth and watched the street through the large glass window. Outside, a cat sat atop a fence post, unmoving. A car rolled by, its engine a low, distant hum. I told myself I was imagining the tension. I told myself that this was what peace felt like. It was quiet. It was ordered. It was fine. I took a sip of my coffee and let the warmth settle in my chest, trying to ignore the way the ticking of the wall clock seemed to be growing louder, echoing in the hollow space of the room. Tick, tick, tick. I was a man of clarity. I was a man of instructions, and as far as I could tell, the town was following the manual perfectly. By Thursday, the golden stillness of Oakhaven began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a held breath. The air remained stagnant, the sky a bruised shade of violet as the sun began its slow descent behind the hills. I was in my kitchen, the room bathed in a hazy, amber light that caught the dust motes dancing in the air. I was preparing a simple tea, the whistle of the kettle a sharp, lonely sound in the void of the house. I looked out the window at David's lawn. He was there again, but he wasn't collecting the mail, and he wasn't tending to the hedges. He was simply standing. He was positioned in the exact center of his driveway, facing his own front door. He stood with his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his navy blue robe catching the dying light. I watched him. 5 minutes passed, then 10. He didn't shift his weight from one foot to the other. He didn't reach up to scratch his face. He didn't even turn his head when a stray crow landed on the pavement just a few feet away, cawing loudly into the silence. I felt a small, cold prickle of curiosity at the base of my neck. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the professional irritation of an editor seeing a character break their established arc. David was a man of motion. He was a man who checked his watch. This absolute stillness felt like a defect in the machinery. Maybe he locked himself out, I whispered. My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the kitchen, bouncing off the tile backsplash. I set my mug down on the counter. The ceramic made a sharp clack that seemed to ring for an eternity. I walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the glass. The pane was cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the room. I waited for him to move, to reach for a key, to sigh, to do anything human. Finally, David's head turned. It wasn't a smooth motion. It was a series of tiny, incremental jerks like a frame-by-frame animation. He looked directly at my window. Even from that distance, I could see his eyes. They were wide, too wide, reflecting the orange glow of the sunset like two polished marbles. He didn't look embarrassed to be caught staring. He just raised his hand in that small, familiar wave. His palm was flat. His fingers were pressed tight together. He held the position for 5, 10, 15 seconds. I pushed the window up. The frame groaned, the sound of wood against wood feeling like a physical assault on the quiet. David, everything okay over there? The wind didn't carry my voice. It seemed to swallow it. David didn't lower his hand. He kept it raised, a stiff greeting to a neighbor he couldn't possibly be seeing clearly through the glare. I'm fine, he called back. His voice was wrong. It was too loud, too bright, like a recording played at the wrong volume. There was no texture to it, no breathiness. It was a flat, tonal announcement. "I'm fine, Henry. Everything is fine." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned toward his house, but he didn't walk to the door. He began to move toward the side gate that led to the backyard. His gait was stiff, his knees barely bending, his feet dragging slightly across the asphalt with a dry, rasping sound. Fritch, fritch, fritch. I closed the window and turned the lock. The click felt strangely final. "It's his back," I told myself, leaning against the sink. "The man is nearly 60. Sciatica. A pinched nerve. It makes you stand tall. It makes you move carefully. It's perfectly logical." But my mind began to iterate, sliding through possibilities like a search engine. If it was his back, why didn't he mention it? Why the shouting? And why the Miller family, 2 houses down? Later that evening, as the stars began to poke through the hazy sky, I went out to take the trash to the curb. The streetlights had just flickered on, humming with a low-frequency buzz that felt like it was vibrating inside my skull. The Millers were out on their driveway. They were standing by the back of their SUV. The trunk was wide open, the interior light casting a harsh, clinical white glow over them. Mrs. Miller was holding a brown paper grocery bag. She wasn't putting it in, she wasn't taking it out. She was just holding it against her chest, her knuckles white from the grip. Mr. Miller stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder in what should have been a gesture of affection, but his fingers were splayed wide and stiff, like a wooden prop. They were both staring into the empty trunk. "Evening," I said, my voice cracking slightly as I rolled the plastic bin. The wheels rattled over the cracks in the driveway, clack, 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 the loudest sound on the street. They both turned their heads at exactly the same time. A synchronized, mechanical snap. They didn't smile with their eyes, they smiled with their teeth. "Evening, Henry," Mr. Miller said. The pitch was identical to David's. "Doing some late shopping?" I asked, trying to inject a note of casual normalcy into the air. "Oh no," he said. He didn't move his hand from his wife's shoulder. "We're fine. We're just fine." "The bag looks heavy, Sarah," I said, looking at Mrs. Miller. "Want a hand with that?" She didn't look at the bag. She didn't look at the car. She looked at the bridge of my nose. "It's fine. I'm fine. We are all fine." I stood there for a moment, the handle of the trash bin cold in my hand. I waited for the follow-up. The "How's work, Henry?" Or the "Going to the game on Saturday?" But the air remained empty. They just stood there in that white LED glow, 2 figures in a frozen tableau, smiling at me with terrifying consistency. I nodded, muttered a goodnight, and walked back up my driveway. I didn't just lock the door this time. I slid the deadbolt. I stood in my hallway, listening to the silence of my own house. I realized I was holding my breath. I went to the living room and turned on the television, desperate for a human voice that wasn't a script. A local news anchor was reporting on a mundane weather update. She was beautiful, her hair perfect, her suit pressed. But as she spoke about the approaching frost, I noticed she wasn't looking at the camera lens. She was looking just a few inches to the left, her eyes fixed on something unseen. "The harvest is in," she said, her smile never wavering. "The roads are clear. Everything is fine. We are all fine." I clicked the power off. The screen faded to a single, white dot before vanishing into black. I sat in the dark, the only sound the rhythmic tock-tock-tock of the wall clock. "Fine," I thought. I repeated the word in my head until it lost its meaning. It wasn't a description anymore. It was a status report, a confirmation of a system with no errors. But in the quiet of Oakhaven, the errors were starting to feel like the only thing that was real. By Saturday morning, the word "fine" had ceased to be a response and had become a vibration, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the very soil of the valley. I woke up at 6 a.m., but I didn't get out of bed. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, watching a single shadow stretch across the plaster. I was listening. Usually, Saturday mornings in Oakhaven were punctuated by the sounds of life. The distant whine of a leaf blower, the muffled laughter of children, the clinking of ceramic plates through open windows. But today there was only the wind. And even the wind sounded tired, barely rustling the dry leaves on the oak branches. I eventually forced myself to move. My joints felt stiff, as if the stillness of the house had begun to settle into my own tendons. I skipped the coffee. The thought of the kettle's whistle made my skin crawl. Instead, I decided to go to the park. I needed to see a crowd. I needed to see the messy, unpredictable movement of people who weren't my neighbors. The walk to the town square felt longer than usual. The air was thick, carrying a scent I couldn't quite place, something metallic and sharp, like the smell of a penny held in a warm palm. As I turned the corner toward the park, the scene that greeted me was, at first glance, a postcard of suburban perfection. Families were scattered across the great lawn. Children were on the playground. Couples sat on blankets near the pond. But as I stepped onto the grass, the postcard began to melt. I stopped near the swing set. There were 3 children there. They weren't swinging. They were sitting on the black rubber seats, their small hands gripped white around the rusted chains. They were swaying, but only because the wind was pushing them. Their legs hung limp. They weren't looking at each other. They were all staring at the same spot on the horizon, their faces set in expressions of vacant, terrifying serenity. I moved toward the pond. A man was walking a golden retriever on a leather leash. The dog wasn't sniffing the bushes or straining against the collar. It was walking in a perfectly straight line, its paws hitting the pavement with a rhythmic, synchronized thud-thud-thud. When the man stopped, the dog stopped. They stood there, 2 statues reflected in the dark, motionless water of the pond. A cold, heavy knot of dread began to tighten in my stomach. It was a physical sensation, a sickening weight that made it hard to breathe. I looked around, desperate to find one person who was moving, truly moving. I saw a woman I recognized from the library. Her name was Sarah. She was sitting on a green wooden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her back was as straight as a ruler. "Sarah," I said, my voice sounding cracked and small in the vast, quiet park. She didn't turn her head. Her eyes shifted toward me, a slow, wet slide of her pupils. "Hello, Henry." I stepped closer, my shadow falling over her. "Sarah, look at the park. Look at the children. Something is wrong. Don't you feel it? The air, the silence, it's not right." Sarah's smile didn't twitch. It was a perfect, unchanging crescent. But as I looked closer, I saw a single tear track down her cheek. It moved with agonizing slowness, carving a wet path through her foundation. Her expression didn't break. Her brow didn't furrow. She didn't even blink to clear the moisture. "I don't know what you mean, Henry," she said. Her voice was a flat monotone, devoid of any inflection. "It's a beautiful day. I'm fine. Everything is fine. But you're crying," I whispered, reaching out a hand. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach up to wipe the tear. "I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine." She said it 3 times, the words falling from her lips like coins onto a stone floor. "I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine." The phrase began to lose all linguistic meaning. It became a mantra, a protective shell, a wall of sound designed to keep me out. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I began to walk, then jog, then run. I needed to get back to Willow Lane. I needed the familiar walls of my house. But as I ran, I saw them everywhere. A man standing by a water fountain, staring at the spout. A group of teenagers in a circle, their phones in their pockets, looking at the center of the grass. All of them smiling. All of them still. When I reached my street, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, jagged shadows that looked like grasping fingers across the asphalt. David was at his mailbox. He was holding a stack of white envelopes. He wasn't looking at them. He was staring at my front door. David! I shouted, gasping for air. I stood at the edge of my driveway, my chest heaving. David, listen to me. The park. Sarah. The children. No one is moving, David. Something is happening to us. David turned his head. I heard it then. A series of soft, dry clicks from his neck, like the sound of a plastic gear being forced to turn. Henry, he said. His voice was calm. Too calm. It was the voice of a man explaining a simple math problem to a slow student. You look tired. Your heart is beating too fast. Of course it is, I yelled. Look around you. Look at the Millers. They haven't moved from their porch in 3 hours. David took a step toward me. He didn't lift his feet. He slid them across the driveway, the soles of his slippers making a dry, rasping sound. There is no need for such volume, David said. He stopped at the edge of the grass. The orange light of the sunset caught the salt in his hair. Everything is fine. I am fine. You are fine. I am not fine. I screamed, the sound echoing off the houses. For a split second I saw a flicker in his eyes. A flash of something dark, ancient, and deeply confused. His smile faltered, his lower lip trembling for the briefest of moments. But then, as if a switch had been flipped, the mask snapped back into place. You will be, David said. Just give it time, Henry. We are all fine here. I turned and fled into my house. I slammed the door and threw the deadbolt. I leaned my back against the wood, listening to the silence of the neighborhood. Through the small peephole, I saw David. He hadn't moved. He was still standing there, his hand raised in that flat, unmoving wave, staring at my door in the deepening purple of the twilight. I went into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. My hands were shaking. I looked in the mirror, desperate to see a human face, a messy face, an unfine face. But as I stared at my reflection, I noticed my own hands. They were resting on the porcelain edge of the sink. They had stopped shaking. I tried to make them move. I tried to ball them into fists. There was a delay. A tiny, microscopic gap between the command in my brain and the movement of my fingers. It was as if my nervous system was being rerouted through a layer of thick, invisible honey. I forced my hand to move. I gripped the faucet so hard the metal bit into my palm. I began to hum, a frantic, off-key tune, just to fill the silence. But outside, the street lights hummed back, and I knew that 40 people were standing in the dark, their eyes wide, their hearts slowing down to match the rhythm of the clock on my wall. Tick, tick, tick. The pattern was complete. The stillness was no longer outside. It was beginning to find its way in. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in my living room, the darkness of the house feeling like a heavy, velvet shroud. I didn't turn on the lights. I was afraid that the brightness would act as a beacon, drawing those wide, unblinking eyes toward my windows. I sat with a flashlight clutched in my lap, but I kept it off. I just felt the cold, hard plastic, a tactile reminder of a world that still functioned by flicking a switch. I tried to explain it. That is what I do. I am an editor. I find the logic. I fix the sequence. I tell the story of how things work. Maybe it's environmental, I whispered to the empty room. My voice was a dry rasp, barely more than a breath. A gas leak, carbon monoxide, a chemical in the municipal water supply that affects the basal ganglia, causing catatonia and echolalia. I clung to these thoughts like a drowning man to a shard of wood. I thought about mass hysteria, the dancing plague of 1518, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic. History was full of moments where the human mind simply broke in unison. We are social animals, after all. We mirror each other. If the person next to us smiles, we smile. If the whole town says they are fine, eventually, the brain stops looking for reasons why they aren't. But as the hours crawled by, the logic began to erode. Mass hysteria doesn't make a dog walk in a synchronized pulse. Mass hysteria doesn't slow the swing of a pendulum. I looked at the clock on my wall. The moonlight caught the brass weight as it moved. Tick, tick, tick. I started to count with it, trying to keep my internal rhythm aligned with the mechanical one. 1, 2, 3. I found myself slowing down. My counting started to fall behind the clock. I had to force my tongue to move against the roof of my mouth. It felt heavy, like it was being coated in a layer of fine, gray silk. "I'm fine," I whispered. I slapped my own face. The sting was sharp, a sudden explosion of heat in the cold room. It felt wonderful. It was a reminder of blood, of nerves, of friction. I stood up and paced. I moved my arms in wide, erratic circles. I did jumping jacks until my lungs burned. I was a frantic machine of motion, a desperate protest against a house that wanted to be still. I thought about leaving. I could get in my car. I could drive out of the valley. I could head toward the city, where the air is loud and the people are angry and messy and impatient. I craved the mess. I craved the sound of a horn honking or someone shouting in the street. I craved the sight of someone crying because they were sad, not because their body was leaking while their face stayed frozen. I moved to the window and peeled back the curtain just a fraction. David was still there. It was 3 a.m., and he was standing on his driveway, bathed in the pale, sickly blue glow of the moon. He hadn't moved since twilight. He was facing the street, his navy robe hanging perfectly still. The Millers were on their lawn, too. They were standing back to back now, their silhouettes merging into a single, two-headed shape. They weren't moving to keep warm in the October chill. They weren't shivering. They were simply part of the landscape, as permanent as the oak trees. If I went out there, would they stop me? Would they reach out with those stiff, clicking limbs and hold me in place until the cement hardened around me, too? Or would they just watch? Would they stand there with their flat palms and their toothy smiles, waving me away into the night? I realized then that the fear wasn't of being attacked. It was the fear of the void. Oakhaven was a hole in the world, and everyone was falling into it, one by one, until there was nothing left but a town of empty mirrors reflecting a silent sky. I sat back down on the sofa. I tried to think of my sister. She lived in Chicago. I tried to remember her phone number. 312. What were the next digits? I had called her 1,000 times. I knew it by heart. 3125. It was gone. The memory was a smooth, white wall. I tried to think of my favorite book, a worn paperback I had read every year. I could see the cover, a deep blue with gold lettering. I could see the font. But when I tried to read the words in my mind, they were just shapes, meaningless symbols. I looked at my hands in the dark. They were back on my lap. They were perfectly still. I felt a wave of calm wash over me. It was terrifyingly peaceful. It was the feeling of a heavy, warm blanket being pulled slowly over my head. "I'm fine," a voice in my head said. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't the voice of the man who edited manuals or the man who lived on Willow Lane. It was the voice of the valley. It was the collective breath of 1,000 people who had finally stopped struggling. "No," I said, biting my lip until I tasted the metallic tang of salt. "I'm not. I'm scared. I'm lonely. I'm losing the sequence." But the words felt small. They felt like pebbles thrown into an abyss. I realized that Oakhaven wasn't a place you could just drive away from. It was a condition. It was what happened when you stopped fighting the quiet. It was what happened when you finally accepted that nothing would ever change again, and that the order of things was more important than the life within them. I stood up one more time, my movements sluggish, as if I were moving through waist-deep water. I had to make a plan. I had to get out before the sun came up, before the morning joggers appeared on the street, moving with their rhythmic, mechanical stride, before Mrs. Gable went back to her roses with her glinting shears. I reached for my car keys on the coffee table. My hand stopped an inch away. I stared at the keys. They were silver. They had a small, blue keychain. They were the ticket to the noise. I just had to move my fingers. I just had to grab them. I stayed like that for a long time, my hand hovering in the air, a statue in a dark living room. I was wondering, if I stayed, if I just let go, I wouldn't have to worry anymore. I wouldn't have to fix the jagged sentences of the world. I wouldn't have to remember phone numbers. I wouldn't have to feel the sharp, biting edge of the before and the after. I could just be. Everything would be so simple. Everything would be fine. The first light of dawn began to bleed through the gaps in my curtains. It wasn't a triumphant sun. It was a pale, anesthetic gray that didn't bring warmth, only visibility. It illuminated the dust motes hanging motionless in the air, each one suspended like a tiny, frozen planet. I was still standing in the middle of my living room. My hand was still hovering an inch above the car keys. I felt a strange sensation in my legs. It wasn't the pins and needles of a limb falling asleep. It was a slow, heavy dullness, as if my blood were being replaced by cool mercury. The sensation was creeping upward, past my knees, settling into my hips. It was the feeling of a foundation being poured. I looked at the keys. They seemed to be receding, as if the coffee table were growing longer, the silver metal becoming a distant star in a dark galaxy. They belonged to a man who lived by the clock, a man who moved and breathed and made mistakes. I could barely remember the weight of them in my pocket. A sound drifted in from the street. It was a soft, rhythmic shuffling like a dry broom over concrete. I forced myself to move. It took an act of sheer, agonizing will to pull my gaze away from the keys. I dragged my feet toward the window, my muscles groaning with the effort. Every step felt like I was wading through deep, cooling wax. I peeled back the curtain. It was David. He was at the end of his driveway, wearing his navy blue robe. He was waiting. The newspaper delivery truck came crawling down Willow Lane. It didn't have the usual haste. The engine didn't roar, it purred with a low, hypnotic hum. The driver didn't throw the papers from the window. He stopped at every single house. He got out with slow, deliberate movement. He walked to the end of each driveway and placed the paper directly into the waiting hands of the resident. David took his paper. He didn't look at the headlines. He didn't even tuck it under his arm. He just held it against his chest with both hands, staring at the driver. The driver looked at David. Their eyes met in a long, unblinking exchange. "How are you this morning, David?" the driver asked. His voice was a smooth, resonant chord that seemed to vibrate the glass of my window. "I'm fine," David said. His voice was no longer loud or bright. It was a perfect, level tone. "Good," the driver said, his smile widening by a fraction of a millimeter. "I'm fine, too." The driver moved to the next house. I felt a sudden, violent surge of panic. It was the last spark of the fire, the final protest of the man who didn't want to be a statue. My heart gave one frantic, irregular thump against my ribs. A messy, beautiful, human beat. I lunged for the keys. My fingers fumbled, cold and stiff, but I snatched them. The jingle of the metal was like a scream in the quiet house. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I stumbled toward the door, my movements erratic and clumsy. I unbolted the lock, the metal sliding back with a sharp, industrial screech. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the morning. The air was freezing, smelling of damp earth and the metallic scent of the frost. It felt sharp in my lungs, and I welcomed the pain. I moved toward my car, my feet tripping over the edges of the driveway. The car was covered in a thin, crystalline layer of ice that blurred the windows. "Going somewhere, Henry?" The voice came from my left. I froze. David was standing at the edge of his lawn. He had turned his head to watch me, his neck making that dry, clicking sound. "I'm leaving," I said. My voice was a raspy, broken thing. "I'm getting out of the valley, David." "Why?" David asked. He didn't sound angry. He didn't even sound curious. He sounded like a recording of a memory. "Because something is wrong," I shouted, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the key, trying to find the lock on the car door. My fingers were thick, like I was wearing heavy mittens made of my own skin. You're all stuck. Look at yourself." "Nothing is wrong," David said. He began to slide toward me. He didn't lift his slippers. He glided over the asphalt, a slow, unstoppable movement. "We're all here. We're all safe. We're all fine, Henry. Don't come near me," I warned, finally finding the lock. I threw the door open and scrambled inside. The interior of the car smelled of stale upholstery, old coffee, and a forgotten gym bag. It was a messy, human, imperfect smell. I gripped the steering wheel, the plastic cold and real. I jammed the key into the ignition. I looked at the dashboard. The digital clock flickered. 7:15 a.m. I looked at David. He was standing right outside my driver's side window now. He wasn't touching the glass, but his face was inches away. His eyes were wide and perfectly still, reflecting the gray morning sky like two dead screens. "You look stressed, Henry," he said, his voice muffled by the window but perfectly clear in my head. "The world is so loud out there. So many numbers. So many errors. You should come back inside. We can have coffee. You'll feel better. You'll feel fine. Leave me alone," I whispered, and I turned the key. The engine groaned. It clicked. Crank, crank, crank. It didn't catch. I tried again, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Crank, crank, click. "It's okay," David said. He didn't move a muscle. "The car is fine. It just wants to stay." I felt the dullness spreading again. It was in my arms now. It was in my shoulders. My grip on the steering wheel began to loosen, not because I wanted it to, but because my hands were forgetting what it meant to hold on. I looked at the road ahead. Willow Lane was a perfect, straight line leading out of the valley. I could see the hills in the distance. I could imagine the city beyond them, the sirens, the shouting, the dirt, the wonderful, chaotic uncertainty of it all. I could try one more time. I could find the strength to turn the key again, to shift into gear, to floor the gas and burst through this emerald silence. I could be the one who broke the pattern. But then I looked at David. He looked so peaceful. I looked at the Millers. They were on their porch now, sitting in their Adirondack chairs, watching the sun rise. They looked like they had never known a moment of doubt in their entire lives. No more editing manuals. No more phone numbers to forget. No more anxiety about the future or regret about the past. Oakhaven wasn't a prison. It was a promise. It was the promise that the struggle was over. I let go of the steering wheel. I felt my fingers relax. They stayed in the curved shape of the wheel for a long, quiet second, and then they slowly, gracefully straightened. I leaned back into the headrest. The plastic of the seat felt like a part of my own back. David tapped on the glass. 3 soft, rhythmic tap. "Are you okay, Henry?" he asked. I looked at him. I looked at the soft, muted colors of the trees. I looked at the stillness of the street. The panic was gone. The jagged edges of my mind were being sanded down, smoothed into a flat, clear surface. The memories of the city were drifting away like smoke in a windless room. I reached out and opened the car door. I stepped out onto the driveway. The air didn't feel cold anymore. It didn't feel like anything. It was just a medium for me to exist in. David placed a hand on my shoulder. It was heavy. It was steady. It didn't shake. It felt like the weight of a mountain. The day proceeded as all days do in Oakhaven. I walked back into my house. I didn't bother to lock the door. There was no need to keep anything out, and there was certainly no need to keep anything in. I went into the kitchen, but I didn't brew coffee. I didn't need the caffeine to wake me. I was already exactly as awake as I needed to be. I walked out to my front lawn. I chose a spot near the center of the grass. I faced my front door. I adjusted my stance until my weight was perfectly balanced between my heels and my toes. I stayed there. I saw Mrs. Gable. She was kneeling on her foam pad in the rose garden. She wasn't cutting anything. She was just holding the shears, her eyes fixed on a single, frost-covered petal. We exchanged a look, a long, slow acknowledgement across the distance of our lawns. I saw the Millers. They were still on their porch. They were watching a robin that had landed on the grass. The robin wasn't hopping. It wasn't searching for worms. It was a red-breasted statue, its head tilted at a permanent angle, listening to the silence. I felt the sun on my face. It moved across the sky with a slow, majestic indifference. I didn't check the time. I didn't have a watch. I had left it on the dresser, its tiny gears ticking away for no one. Every now and then, a car would drive by. It would move at a steady, rhythmic pace. The driver would wave. I would wave back, a flat palm against the air. No fingers moving, no greeting called out, just the wave. I didn't feel the need to speak. There was nothing left to edit. The story was finished. I was part of the neighborhood now. I was a link in the chain. I was the weight that kept the valley still. Sometimes I would see someone new, a hiker from the trails or a delivery driver who hadn't been here before. They would have that frantic, jagged look in their eyes. They would be checking their phones, muttering about the lack of signal, their movements fast and wasteful. I would feel a flicker of something deep inside, a ghost of an old itch, a memory of what it felt like to be in a hurry. But then I would simply look at them and smile. They would stop. They would see my emerald lawn. They would see my steady hands. They would see the absolute, unwavering peace on my face. "Are you okay?" they would ask, their voices high and thin. I would wait a beat, just long enough for the silence of Oakhaven to settle over them like falling snow. "I'm fine," I would say. And I would watch them. I would watch their shoulders drop. I would watch their breathing slow. I would watch them put their phones in their pockets and look up at the trees. They would stop moving. They would join the line. Tonight, I am standing on my back porch. The fireflies are out. They are flickering in the dark woods at the edge of the property. They aren't flying. They are just hovering in the air, glowing and fading in perfect synchronization. The hum of the streetlights is my lullaby. I am looking at my hands. They are resting on the wooden railing. They have been there for 4 hours. They look like they are made of the same wood as the house. I am not tired. I am not hungry. I am not afraid. The valley is full now. Every house is occupied. Every lawn has its watcher. We are a town of completed works. We are a world without typos. I can hear the wind in the oak. It doesn't sound like wind anymore. It sounds like 1,000 voices whispering the same word over and over again. A soft, endless, rhythmic chorus. I close my eyes. The world is still. The world is balanced. Everything is exactly as it should be. Everything is fine.